3 days earlier, I'd briefed Snake on his final mission. The rotor blades of my helicopter hung over the cemetery, the downwash spurring the carpet of flowers into a mad dance. I climbed down from the helicopter and landed in the white field of the virtuous stars of Bethlehem and walked towards Snake, who stood fixed before one of the graves. The graves belonged to warriors never spoken about, those convicted of war crimes, those whose records for some reason had all been stricken. Among them, some were regarded as heroes by more than a few soldiers. Snake's back was to me, and he didn't speak loudly, but his low, powerful rumble carried clearly over the rotor's noise. Otacon, even the dead have ears. Snake, we've got to go. He turned to give me a dubious look. I responded, You've got an old friend waiting for you in the helicopter. He followed me through the rows of tombstones. Then he said, The test results. My reply caught in my mouth. Of course I'd known he'd ask. I'd thought about how to tell him, but I still had no idea what I should say. I started with the scientific facts. I tried to present them as objectively as possible. Proteome analysis was positive, but the MNRA analysis turned up negative. The wrinkled skin, the hardened arteries, your early aging symptoms look like classic Werner syndrome. But none of the tests were able to pinpoint the cause. So? Snake wanted to cut to the heart of the matter, the painful end that awaited his body. He wasn't afraid. He'd seen his body dying, and he'd accepted it. He'd accepted that he wasn't human, that he wasn't born from nature. From the beginning, he'd seemingly accepted the fate that awaited his cloned body. I was the one who couldn't accept it. Well, judging by how rapidly the aging has progressed, I'd say... My words trailed off. Snake was waiting for me to continue. I had to tell him. I had to give him the truth. He was ready to hear it. He'd long been ready. But my throat was frozen with sorrow and fear. I opened my mouth, but no voice came. Instead, I felt tears well up. A year at best, right? My reply felt hollow. Yeah. Snake paused to gaze at the bed of blooming flowers that the white petals kicked up into the air by the helicopter's wind. He watched them as if his life were floating away. There was such sadness in his eyes. I found myself saying, Snake, let's try another doctor. Some ordinary doctor won't make a difference. I'm not an ordinary man to begin with. Not to mention Foxdie. You're right. Foxdie. A virus programmed to selectively kill specific people had been injected into Snake's body as part of a plan 9 years ago prior to annihilate the terrorist group Foxhound. It still lived on inside of him. I added, But we don't know where Naomi is. Even if we found her, would she be able to do anything? It was then I realized I was clinging to a narrow hope. No one in the world had better understanding of Snake's cloned body than Dr. Naomi Hunter. She had participated in the mission at Shadow Moses Island and helped create the Foxdie virus. But would she be able to stop his relentless aging? I couldn't make myself think so. To a stranger, he'd likely seem to be in his 70s. In actuality, he was still in his 40s. An ordinary man experiencing such rapid aging would be inconceivable. That was clearly a genetic disease streaming from his manipulated genome. But old age was old age, no matter how extraordinary the circumstances of this one case. Age remained a mechanism within all life, a mechanism that mankind had not yet devised a method to halt. No one could escape death from old age. Neither I nor Snake could believe that Naomi would have any power to prevent it. Snake turned at the sound of a familiar voice calling his name. An elderly man was seated in the back of the helicopter, leaning on a cane for support. "Colonel," Snake said, and I was relieved to hear a little brightness, no matter how brief, return to Snake's voice. Snake and I climbed into the helicopter as he shook Colonel Roy Campbell's hand. "I'm not a colonel anymore, Snake." Campbell had long since retired from the military, but to Snake he was both a superior officer and a friend, and he would always be colonel. Snake noticed Campbell's suit and grinned. This was the first time he'd encountered the man in anything but a uniform. "I'd figured the only place I'd ever see you dressed like that would be at your daughter's wedding." Campbell's face briefly darkened. Meryl. She was his daughter, though he still hadn't been able to tell her as much. Meryl was the result of an affair with his sister-in-law. Campbell's brother later died in the Gulf War, and the colonel seemed too ashamed to tell her the truth. She knew Campbell only as her uncle. We all are burdened by our sins. Even Campbell. Even me. Snake asked, "What are you doing these days?" Campbell pulled himself back from thoughts of his daughter and replied, "I'm working for an organization under the UN Security Council, the Analysis and Assessment Staff of the PMC Oversight and Inspection Committee. I remember the resolution being passed a few years ago. Snake, I came across some information in my work." Snake narrowed his eyes. Campbell continued, "We found him. In the Middle East." Him. Snake knew who that was in an instant. "We've got to stop him," the colonel said. "Now, before it's too late." Snake looked at me. I nodded. Liquid's made his move. The whirl of the helicopter's rotor increased in pitch. The aircraft lifted off the ground, and the white stars of Bethlehem quickly faded into the distance. "The Manhattan incident triggered a serious public backlash," Campbell explained. "Now the U.S. has to think twice in intervening militarily in other countries' affairs. This has fueled a push toward military privatization, with PMCs at the heart of that movement." "Every age has its mercenaries," Snake said. "These PMCs are nothing new. We've been dealing with them before the turn of the century." "No, Snake. They're nothing like the mercenaries of the past. The Department of Defense's new battlefield control system has produced a decisive difference between the hired guns of the past and the PMCs of today." I added, "The system was developed by Arms Tech Security." A glimmer of recognition came to Snake's eyes. "Arms Tech? You mean AT Corp?" Campbell nodded. "In recent years, AT Corp has shifted focus from weapons development to security tools. And since the establishment of AT Security, business has been booming. The system makes it possible to integrate not only micro-level information on individual soldiers and units, but also macro-level information about field conditions and order of battle." Snake sighed. In an effort to recreate the prosperity of the atomic age in the post-Cold War world, Arms Tech and DARPA had worked together on the Metal Gear Rex project. After the Shadow Moses incident and the death of Arms Tech's president as a result of Foxdie, the company fell on hard times, but now it had undergone an unorthodox restructuring. If that president could now see the fruits of his labors, I wonder if he'd laugh. "So," Snake said, "they finally managed total real-time battlefield control?" Campbell nodded again. "There's more. State governments and rebel groups can't match the maintenance price of standing forces. PMCs, by comparison, are reliable, easy to use. It wasn't long before everyone had them on the payroll, and as a result, regular armies began to decline worldwide." I thought back to the graveyard of fallen warriors. The legendary mercenary, Big Boss, and the true patriot, the Boss, and all the other soldiers buried there, had fought for nations. War has changed. Now there was no place for heroes or legends. They had been replaced with pure profit and efficiency. It's hard to believe, I know, Campbell said, but PMCs are beginning to overtake conventional armies in terms of scale. Nowadays, it's the PMCs that serve as standard battalions. They already make up 60% of all combat forces in conflict zones. Snake was taken back. 60%? The fact is the world now depends largely on PMCs for waging its wars. I thought it was the UN that authorized the PMCs in the first place. The U.S. abstained from voting on that resolution. In effect, Washington was endorsing PMCs without ever revealing its true intentions. Campbell drew in a deep breath. Until they got wind of the uprising, that is. I pulled a report out of my briefcase and handed it to Snake. The documents outlined the 5 major PMCs. Piovre Armament, Ravensword, Werewolf, Otselitovea, Kvatka, and Praying Mantis. There are hundreds of PMCs in business worldwide, I explained, and their numbers are growing. Currently, 5 of them are big enough to be labeled global powers, 2 in the U.S. and 1 each in the U.K., France, and Russia. Campbell nodded. Reconnaissance has revealed that those 5 PMCs are run by dummy corporations that act as fronts for a single mother company. Its name? Outer Heaven. Snake's eyes popped open. You mean? Outer Heaven. The place where soldiers could always find sanctuary. Big Boss had founded the mercenary agency, and Liquid Snake, his son, and Solid Snake's brother, had attempted to re-establish it at Shadow Moses Island. That's right, Campbell said. It's Liquid. He's taken command of this immense army and is now preparing to unleash an insurrection. I watched him die. That was at Shadow Moses. Liquid was killed by Naomi's modified strain of fox dye. His will lives on, the colonel explained, in the body of the man once known as Ocelot. He aims to fan the flames of war even higher, to create the perfect world once envisioned by Big Boss. The one world in which soldiers will always have a place. A world where soldiers were needed. A world where a soldier could say, "This is where I belong." Many times Big Boss and Liquid Snake sought to bring about that world, and many times had Solid Snake stopped them. The world envisioned by Big Boss was one of a constant state of war, a world where soldiers were needed in every nation, a world whose peoples killed each other endlessly. It was time for Campbell to say what he had come to say. He must be stopped, before it's too late. Snake didn't say anything. Instead, he gazed out the window of the helicopter at the passing scenery below. I looked at his face, and in his eyes I saw such deep resolve and such strong will that I was nearly moved to tears. Even now his body continued its slow, relentless deterioration. My friend was dying. His hypertrophic heart, enlarged like a piece of old, stretched-out rubber, hadn't the strength to send blood circulating through his body. His lungs, stiffened by pulmonary fibrosis, could no longer absorb enough oxygen. But even with his body tortured by those and countless other afflictions, Snake continued to fight, to set right his curse. One not of his choice, but rather placed upon him before he had been granted life in this world. The helicopter tilted forward, and through the windows I saw Nomad, a large military transport plane with a capacity that put the USAF's Globemaster to shame, parked on an airport runway below. Its cargo bay could hold our helicopter with room to spare. We landed on the tarmac, climbed out of the chopper, and ran to Nomad. As we closed the distance, Campbell said, "Do you understand, Snake? Any means necessary. Just stop Liquid's insurrection, even if it means—" The colonel fell silent and stopped in place. We all did, and Snake stared right at Campbell, who looked away with a tortured expression. "Killing him." Snake spoke with no emotion in his voice. "You want Liquid dead, is that right, Colonel?" Campbell closed his eyes, cursing himself for asking the friend he'd been with through so many battles to perform what was essentially a murder. I'm sorry. I know, this isn't justice. It's a covert assignment, a hired hit, a network's op targeting the head of a major multinational corporation. I shook my head. We'd been through a lot together, the three of us. The destruction of secret weaponry, the rescue of a kidnapped scientist, the prevention of a nuclear attack. And I'm not implying that we didn't have blood on our hands, but this would be the first time the mission was simply to kill. Our last mission together would be to kill a man because we wanted him dead. A cool, pleasant breeze blew across the open runway in open defiance of our solemn mood. The sky was clear and blue. Snake looked up at the sun and then started to run toward Nomad. We followed. "Why me?" Snake asked. "Because of the military might of the PMCs and the effect they have on the economy. War is to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th. The pillar that supports the global economy. The global community is concerned, but they're all too afraid of the war economy collapsing to do anything about it. The UN, too. And any intervention through official channels would damage the economic system. America can't step in, and neither can the UN. So it falls to us outcasts to do something about it. Is that it, Colonel?" America has now turned war into a form of economic activity. Analysts are calling it the war economy, in that it's picking up the slack for the downward sloping oil market. Sounds pretty self-serving to me. Snake, this mission isn't an order from Washington, not like the old days. This is not something the UN can officially sanction either. But we can't just look the other way while Liquid plots this insurrection. If we fail to act, he'll become the greatest threat the world has ever faced. We reached Nomad. The hatch at the rear of the transport yawned open, revealing the massive, empty cargo bay. I lent Campbell my arm as we climbed up the ramp. Once inside, Campbell stopped to look into Snake's eyes. "Snake, you're the only man I can trust." Snake returned the Colonel's stare. We'd arrived at our final destiny. Kill Liquid. Sure, we could run. Sure, we could close our eyes, but in the end, we wouldn't be able to escape our fate. "Fine," Snake said. "Let's hear it." Snake pointed to a set of chairs in the temporary command center the Colonel and I had established in the fore of the cargo bay. Even though the mission was urgent, the flight would be long, and Nomad was suitably equipped. There was a workstation complete with multiple LCD monitors connected to Nomad's supercomputer, Gotti. Equipment useful for military applications, including a medical bed, were readily available. A gangway led to upper-level living quarters complete with a bed, a shower, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Campbell sat on the back of his folding chair. "Our intelligence on Liquid's uprising originally comes via reports from U.S. Special Forces, who were mobilized after we at the UN reported our findings. They're tracking Liquid's movements. About 18 hours ago, he was spotted in the Middle East." The Colonel shifted his posture, unable to find a comfortable way to sit. "There's a rebel army there made up of ethnic minorities waging civil war against the regime in power. The core of that regime's army is provided by one of the PMCs under Liquid's control." "What about the rebels?" Snake asked. "The local militias have hired small numbers of operators as trainers and field commanders, and of course they've got help from the local PMCs." "Right," I added. "A proxy war between hired guns." PMC versus PMC. A quagmire of war. All too typical victims of the New World economy. Snake pulled out another cigarette. As he searched his pockets for a lighter, Sonny bounded down the gangway and snatched the unlit cigarette from his lips.
Snake?"
the little girl said.
This is a non-smoking flight."
Snake gave her a chagrined smile and scratched his head. A dumbstruck Campbell watched the child go back upstairs and said, "She's Olga's daughter," I said. With a look of understanding, the Colonel said, "The woman from the Manhattan incident." The one with the daughter kidnapped by the Patriots to extort her cooperation. Yes, that's her. Ryden rescued Sonny from the Patriots, and we took her in. Where's Ryden now? I don't know. After he saved Sonny, we lost all trace of him. Ryden. When the president was kidnapped in a marine decontamination facility 30 kilometers from Manhattan, Ryden had been at first an unwitting pawn of the Patriots, but he joined us in that fight against Solidus Snake, the third son and clone of Big Boss, although the events ended in violence. Truthfully, Solidus and Liquid were only struggling for freedom. They put their very existence on the line, resisting the secret organization, the Patriots, who attempted to control all reality. Looking back now, in the context of the Patriots, that shadow network that manipulated America and the world, I couldn't label Liquid and Solidus as simply evil. She seems to have some trouble speaking, Campbell said. I nodded. Sonny's stutter bothers her. After she was born, she lived under unusual conditions. She carries many burdens, and the stutter is their manifestation. Snake added, and I thought living with us was unusual enough. He'd been getting at me to let her out of Nomad, to show her more of the world, but as long as the Patriots were watching, he couldn't convince me that letting her roam freely outside was the right thing to do. She's a child prodigy, I added. She's different from other children. It's just how she is. She's a prodigy? Campbell asked. I pointed to the supercomputer rack against one of the cargo bay walls. She's amazing at anything technological. She can comprehend the most complicated source code in an instant. She even has a substantial understanding of mechanical engineering. Take this, for example. I stood and retrieved a robot from the rear of the cargo bay. The machine had an LCD screen, 2 legs, and a body just small enough to fit my arms around. Allow me to introduce Metal Gear Mark II. It's a Metal Gear, just like Rex, but this gear is not a weapon. It's a remote mobile terminal designed to provide Snake with operational support. But what does that have to do with Sonny? The Colonel asked. She designed it with me. She had her hand in much of the code, from the auto-balance system to the image recognition routines. I lowered the Mark II to the floor and turned it on from my terminal. The robot booted up and deftly coasted across the cargo bay, rolling on 2 wheels at the end of its feet. But she can't be older than 7 or 8. That is impressive. She's the product of the next generation. I'm already obsolete. Obsolete or not, Snake said, there's still much you have to do. We can't pass on our sins to Sonny's generation. I know, I said. That's what we've been fighting for all this time. Campbell nodded in agreement, then leaned forward, ready to continue to the matter at hand. Snake, you'll be sneaking into the conflict zone via transport truck, disguised as one of the rebel army's hired operators. Your first objective is to make contact with our informants, Rat Patrol 01, shorthand RATPT-01. They'll be expecting you. Rat Patrol, huh? They sound sneaky. They're a special force team assigned to the Army's PMC Investigation Unit, CDI. The Criminal Investigation Command, formerly the Criminal Investigation Division, and still referred to as CID. CID, for continuity, was a law enforcement agency within the Army. Basically, the Army's police. They investigated all crimes within the Army's jurisdiction, from crimes on the battlefield and occupied territory such as mass murder of civilians or cruelty to prisoners, all the way down to simple misdemeanors on base. Snake chuckled. So they're the rats of the Army. Whether you deem them necessary or not, those who sniffed around among your comrades weren't going to be popular. Campbell shook his head. No, I can vouch for them personally. Friends of yours? You could say that. Snake looked at Campbell with narrowed eyes, but the colonel ignored the look and went on. Transportation to the area will be provided under cover of a UN humanitarian aid mission with support from the U.S. military. From there on, though, you'll get no protection and no guarantees from anyone." He paused for emphasis. "And you must not leave behind any evidence of your involvement in that area, let alone that of the UN. If word of this ever leaks out, it would spark a global firestorm." "Same as always," said Snake. "Same as Zanzibar Land and Shadow Moses. It's like in Mission Impossible. If you're caught or killed, we'll disavow any knowledge of your actions. Will you do this for me? Will you terminate Liquid?" Now Campbell looked at me. I nodded. We had to finish this, before Snake's life went up in smoke. "Thank you," Campbell said, his words filling every corner of the cargo bay. The words carried appreciation, not only for the fight we now faced, but for all of Snake's battles, and the painful weight with which they burdened him.